A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started when I found an old Polaroid camera tucked away in the back of my late grandmother's closet. I remember the heavy smell of mothballs as I unspooled the dusty velvet cloth that concealed it, revealing a vintage model, weathered but still functional, the kind that had magic woven into its very being. My curiosity outweighed my hesitation, so I carefully inserted a fresh film pack, feeling a pulse of excitement as I turned it on, the camera sputtering to life with a familiar whir. I went outside, aiming it down the quiet, tree-lined street of my small town. We had moved here for the fresh air and slow pace after my parents divorced, but the shadows of that loss often clouded my mind. I snapped a photo of the old oak tree at the end of the street, and waited for the haunting white rectangle to appear, each second stretching into eternity. When it finally developed, I felt a chill grab hold of my spine. The image was different. The tree looked alive, almost as if the bark twisted into grim faces, their gnarled features captured forever in that small snapshot. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, I took another picture, this one of the concrete steps leading up to my porch. As I waited, I imagined the friends I left behind and their faint promises to keep in touch. Again, the photo revealed something I didn't expect, a distortion, a faint figure looming in the background, features too blurring to define, yet undeniably human. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped through the photos I had already taken that day, and there they were, the shadows lurking in the periphery, always watching me from a distance. With each passing day, the figure seemed to grow bolder, edging closer until one afternoon, the photo revealed a grinning face, eyes glimmering with a hunger I couldn't place. I tried to destroy the film, but the Polaroid had an iron grip on my attention. It felt like an addiction. I became obsessed, snapping photos of everything from my friends to the streets, the grocery store, even the school. Each developed image was more menacing than the last, the figure now merging into other backgrounds, creeping behind people like a detached phantom, mouth twisted into an unsettling grin that chilled my soul. I started to hear whispers around midnight when the house was still and the world succumbed to sleep, faint murmurs resonating through the walls, beckoning me, luring me like a moth to a flame. Sleep-deprived and tormented by my own mind, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, until one night, the bathroom mirror reflected a pair of eyes watching me, dark and hollow, lurking in the corners like it owned them. The haunting presence became a nightly fixture in my dreams, an entity that flickered at the edges of my consciousness, its laugh echoing through the darkness, but I still couldn't look away from the camera. My friends noticed the subtle changes in my behavior. My laughter was forced, my attempts to engage flat and muted. I showed them the photos, thinking they would validate my horror, but they grinned, dismissing my fear as an artistic touch, and I felt isolation swallow me whole as they laughed, unaware of the real terror hidden in those frames. The figure progressed from shadow to physicality, a form that began to materialize, its posture too unnatural to comprehend. One fateful evening, I decided to confront it, to take a picture of the unknown. Somehow coaxing it out into the light, the air crackled with tension as I snapped a photo of the corner of my bedroom, half shrouded in darkness. The blast of the flash illuminated a monstrous creature, a distortion of sanity, its mouth a gaping maw, eyes like black holes of despair, and I gasped, feeling a visceral pull of fear and regret. I staggered backward, heart racing, as the camera slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor. I stared at the photo, breathless, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination, but there it was, lunging at the camera, eternally caught in that moment, like a scream frozen in a state of terror. I couldn't escape the sensation that this creature was hungry, not for food but for something far more sinister, my very essence, my spirit. The next few days blended into an agonizing blur. I was too terrified to sleep, too restless to function. I came across a haunting legend online, an urban tale about the Polaroid man, a tragic figure said to materialize from the desperation of his subjects, absorbing their fears into his being, his twisted form growing stronger with every capture. I wanted to scream, to warn everyone around me, but the camera's voice became my only companion, urging me to take just one more picture, promising that it would all be worth it. I fought the urge until the night I found my best friend waiting outside my door, his familiar laughter slicing through the darkness like a lifeline, but the moment I grabbed the camera, instinctively snapping a photo of him, I watched as the Polaroid developed to reveal not just my friend, but the Polaroid man himself emerging from the shadows, lingering behind him, and in that instant, my friend's expression hardened, turning to fear as he stumbled back, not understanding that I had just signed his fate. That photo was the last straw. I felt like I was battling something unforgiving, and the weight of it crushed me. In a desperate moment, I decided to destroy the camera, bring an end to the madness. I tossed it into the fireplace, but before it could ignite, the entity climbed through my dreams, its laughter betraying me, taunting me. It wouldn't let me escape so easily. I watched in horror as tendrils of shadow curled around my wrists, spirits pleading for release, as their faces appeared in the flames, and in that moment, I understood the raw truth mirrored in those photographs. It wasn't just me. The Polaroid man had never been confined to one picture. He thrived on the fear and despair of everyone whose image he consumed. As panic welled within me, I felt entwined with the growing darkness, woven into the very fabric of his nightmare. I narrowly escaped, practically sprinting from the house, the devil on my heels. I ran down the street, the entity's whispers flooding my ears, the trees around me transforming into grotesque silhouettes. I had to warn my friends, but as I turned the corner, I saw them gathered, laughing, unaware of the phantom creeping ever closer. It struck me like a knife. Every snapshot had been a lure, a spell that would culminate in their demise. The Polaroid man didn't just want me, he had designs on all of them, feeding off their joy while I remained trapped in this waking torment. I could still hear him now, a tantalizing voice echoing through my thoughts, an invitation too perfect to resist as terror rippled through me, ripping screams from my throat as I grasped at the fabric of reality. But just before it consumed me, I made a choice. I knew I had to go back, to confront the curse I had unleashed. I turned, racing home, heart pounding like a war drum, knowing that I had to face the light or forever dwell in the shadows of the suffering I had unknowingly unleashed. The camera still lay waiting, its allure too powerful yet drenched in horror. As I stood there, the Polaroid man's laughter enveloped me, echoing through the empty halls, reminding me that the moment I took that first picture, I had invited something wicked into my world, something that smiled in the darkness every time I cursed my fate. And so, with a trembling finger, I raised the camera one final time, bracing myself for whatever unimaginable terror awaited me in the flash, knowing deep down there would be no escaping the price of my curiosity, or the sinister reality that now demanded flesh and blood. I always believed my wife was the kind of person who turned to her vices only in times of need. I imagine this is what everyone tells themselves to feel better about the gradual unraveling of love, but I guess that's what emphatically made me miss the signs. For months now, I'd watched her growing listlessness, the way she'd appear too withdrawn from me. Her laughter that once echoed through our home began to dwindle down to strained smiles that barely broke the surface of her lips, and the way she turned away from my touch as if my fingers were ice cold against her skin. It was only when I noticed the syringes, a clinical little cluster tucked away beneath the bathroom sink, each needle capped and clean, that an uncomfortable truth began steering itself into my consciousness like an unwanted guest at a party. I sifted through our daily routine, remembering small moments like how her makeup started to dissolve into that pallor of disinterest and how I sometimes caught her locked in a blank stare, deep in thought, at a clock that only ticked toward deadlines I couldn't see. At first, I made excuses for the absences that took her away from me each night, late shifts at the hospital, long nights with her friends indulging in laughter and alcohol, but an undercurrent of suspicion, a nagging at the back of my mind, led me into that dimly lit bathroom one evening, armed with curiosity and an ache I didn't want to feel. I twisted the handle and opened the door to the musty air, coming face to face with the stark array of syringes. I examined them with increasing horror, knowing that no prescribed medication in the world came in such quantities, each syringe brandishing a promise of something far darker. My heart raced as I scrambled through my mental archives of her erratic behavior, the sudden weight loss, the insomnia that wrapped itself around her like a suffocating blanket, and the glazed-over conversations that dimmed her once radiant personality. Could it be drugs? Was I living with someone who had fallen prey to the very demons that transformed lives into chaos? But then a thought flickered in my mind, an alternative narrative that made my insides twist uncomfortably. What if these syringes were merely the symptom of a deeper condition that I hadn't recognized yet? Panic set in, as I began to suspect I was losing her emotionally, so I resolved to confront her, needing some semblance of clarity, only for her to come home late, her eyes gleaming with a fright I didn't understand. I found something, I managed to choke out, standing between her and the living room as a self-appointed gatekeeper. The smartphone she held fell carelessly to the couch, and her gaze darted like a deer caught in headlights before flattening into something weary. "They're just for my anxiety," she said, her body language crumbling as she leant against the door frame, feigning calmness despite the tiny tremors racing through her fingers. In that moment, her denial pierced me through like shards of ice. I could see right through the fabric of her excuse, the way each breath she took felt laborious yet laced with secrets. Days morphed into a cyclical nightmare as I buried myself in research late into the night. I dug through forums and dark web threads, each confirmed suspicion anchoring my concerns into reality. I crossed paths with the names of drugs I'd never heard before, stimulants, mood enhancers, and a realm of substances that thrived in shadows and darkness. My fingers touched every labeled document and news report that hinted at the dangers of addiction, only to find the name of a particular substance that existed beyond legality and ethics, a synthetic concoction rumored to transform users into mere puppets of some clandestine purpose, frayed threads of sanity stitched together in a frantic desperation. It was all too much a revelation to bear, a secret that gnawed at the edges of my psyche. I clung desperately to clarity as weeks flickered by, her late-night absences, the unexplained bruises tracing lines across her forearms like a morbid map, each one an imprint of betrayal and pain. The night I finally confronted her again, the atmosphere buzzed with electric tension. I quaked while she stood opposite me, a mere silhouette against the moonlight casting shadows through our living room window. "You think I'm doing drugs?" she said, a low laugh escaping her lips that split the silence between us like glass shattering onto concrete. "You couldn't be more wrong, John." Her laughter morphed into something darker, a smile that held on to empty shards of her fractured reality. In a breath that felt like poison lingering in the air, she took a step closer, holding her arms out as if a warm embrace could shatter the storm between us. I recoiled instinctively, wanting nothing to do with the unsettling aura surrounding her. "I'm not medicating myself, I'm helping others," she declared, as if her voice had the power to convince us both. My mouth went dry, realizing in that moment how swiftly she slipped away. My sweet, loving wife had transformed into a messenger of something sinister, and I couldn't fight the instinctual dread crawling within me. "What do you mean?" I never meant for the words to betray me, but they slipped out like confetti bursting from a piñata. "You won't understand," she finally whispered, her voice shaking beneath the weight of a hidden truth, then left for the kitchen. I followed behind her, desperate to seize the moment, to grasp any ounce of comfort I could salvage, but what awaited me chilled my blood. There, on the kitchen counter, lay a single syringe filled with a liquid shimmering like starlight, coupled with a series of handwritten notes that revealed the unthinkable. She was using these substances not to numb herself, but somehow to bring back people who'd lost their lives. The words explained it all, whispered promises of chemical society, of using the unbound energy of vitality to escape the confines of death. She had turned into something beyond a mere user. She was a puppeteer pulling strings to orchestrate something far more grotesque than addiction. The realization staggered me, sent jagged patterns racing across my vision, and I stood frozen in horror as she turned, realization dawning in her eyes, something primal igniting within her that felt otherworldly, as she recited the ominous truth: there's a thin line between life and death, and she intended to walk it barefoot. My heart thundered in my chest, but I didn't have the will to run. I wanted to hate her, to scream, to shatter the moment into pieces, but more than anything, I felt like a bystander in my own life, witnessing an act too terrifying to comprehend. In that suffocating moment, the waves of regret and despair pulled me under, and as the moon masked itself behind dark clouds looming outside, I realized I was not only losing my wife but stepping unwittingly into a world where the natural laws of life and death ebbed and flowed at her fingertips, tethered to the ominous allure of those syringes. My family moved a lot when I was a kid, more than most, but I never questioned it. I thought it was normal until the day I found a dusty box hidden in the attic of our latest house, an old Victorian that creaked with memories trapped in its walls. Inside the box were old photographs, each one depicting my parents in various towns, standing in front of unfamiliar houses, smiling, but there was a strangeness in their eyes that I couldn't place. The earliest photo showed a young version of my mother, holding me as an infant, while my dad stood by her side, looking over us with an expression that sent a chill down my spine. In the background of that image, there was something I'd never noticed before, an elongated shadow, stretching across the lawn, not matching the angles of sunlight, as if something was lurking just beyond the frame, waiting. With each subsequent photo, I spotted the same shadow, always just out of focus like a haunting presence, watching, waiting, never revealing its form. I felt an unexpected shiver crawl up my spine, and as I flipped the pages of that worn, Brittle scrapbook. My heart raced harder at the discovery. The shadow grew bolder, creeping closer with each house we left behind. It seemed it had followed us through towns, states, and even the years. Memories flickered in and out of focus in my mind, half-formed recollections of late-night drives, hushed arguments sneaking through the walls as my parents whispered fears I wasn't meant to hear. They spoke of the thing in muffled tones, of how its presence felt like a weight pressing down on their chests, trapping us in apartments with flickering lights and strange neighbors who seemed overly interested in us. I remembered the time we lived in that cramped two-bedroom in a rundown complex, the neighbor's daughter, a girl my age with wild hair and an unsettling smile, who told me that if I listened closely enough at night, I could hear someone calling my name from the shadows outside the window. Her tone was both playful and menacing, and I laughed it off, but I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched. Each night, I'd lie awake, staring through the thin curtains, straining to hear something, anything, that could unravel the mystery behind her words, but I only ever heard silence, thick and suffocating, until the night it changed. The radio in our living room started picking up strange signals. I remember the crackling noise breaking through the quiet routine of family dinners like a bad omen, the music warped and haunting, playing at odd hours, growing louder as the nights wore on. My parents argued more, their faces drawn, worry etched in every line of their features, until finally, they packed us up yet again, disappearing into the early morning before the sun found its way into the sky, abandoning that life like so many others before it. The photos in the box revealed that the thing was never just a figment of my childhood imagination, it was as real as the reshuffling of our lives, a malevolent force that used our very movement to draw closer, feasting on our fear and confusion. I had no idea my life had been a carefully orchestrated escape plan, each family outing, each innocent smile hiding the truth that my parents had built their lives around running from it. As I lay awake that night, clutching the box, I heard my parents arguing again. The desperation in their voices rose like dark storm clouds gathering overhead. The distinct sound of something scraping against the walls made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't my imagination, it felt palpable, a slow, deliberate crawl like fingers testing the boundaries of our safety. My heart raced as the light flickered, my parents' hushed voices now drowned out by the deafening thud of my pulse in my ears. Fear coursed through me as I realized with growing horror that they were debating whether we should leave again. Driven by an instinct I didn't understand, I grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway, half tempted to hurl myself at their feet and beg them not to go, but instead, I pressed myself against the wall and listened, words like daggers piercing the air. "We can't keep running, it won't let us go," my mother's sobs echoed softly. "What if it finds us next time? What if it finds the kids?" My father's voice, hushed, low, responded with a grim finality, "It doesn't matter. No place is safe. We have to protect them at all costs." The sound of dragging was back, closer now, the walls seemed to pulse with the unseen weight of whatever shadow had haunted our lives. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing the terror away, but realized too late that I'd been left alone in the dark. When I opened them again, the hallway shimmered, warped by shadows. A chill raced through my body, and I bolted back into the safety of my room, locking the door behind me. I sat on my bed, clutching the flashlight as if it were a lifeline, whispering to myself that I was safe. But the creaking came again, joining a chorus of whispers in the dark that chilled my blood, "Join us, join us." And every day after that, the words grew clearer until they were a constant echo in my mind, and I realized that I was no longer running from whatever hunted us, I was being called back to it, drawn like a moth to flame as the shadow crept closer, whispering promises of a home where our family would never have to run again. And now, as we stand on the precipice of yet another move, a sense of dread coils in my stomach. I finally understand that whatever this thing is, it wants more than just our fear, it wants to claim us. And the worst part? I think it's close enough to touch, waiting for the moment when we finally stop running, when we finally surrender to our fate. My uncle has a strange set of rules, an eccentricity that only heightened in the weeks leading to his tragic death, and I can't shake the feeling that following them was never about his quirks, but something darker hiding beneath. At first, they seemed harmless: never let your feet dangle off the edge of the bed, always knock 3 times before entering a room, and the most haunting of all, never speak the names of the dead, lest they come for you. As a child, I thought it was just typical uncle nonsense, a way to get me to mind my manners, but once I became a teen, those rules morphed into something sinister, something I could feel stalking me in the shadows. The last Christmas I spent with him, when I was just 18, he'd become decidedly more erratic, often staring out of windows as if waiting for someone. He insisted on drawing a circle of salt around the house, which he said would keep outsiders away, outsiders being anyone that the dead might send to claim someone alive. We all laughed at him, my parents, my cousins, and I, but there was a moment, a flicker in his eyes when he joined us for dinner, that made my skin crawl. It was as if he held on to terrible knowledge that no one else could comprehend. He insisted we follow his rules strictly, cramming them into every conversation, almost like he was in a race against time, and I found myself uneasy, grasping at the thin, cold thread of dread that snaked deeper into my soul. It all spiraled out of control that fateful night when he locked himself in his study after announcing that the dead were coming for him. We peered through the keyhole, too curious and scared to abandon our uncle in what felt like growing madness, and heard him muttering to himself about the names he should never speak aloud. My curiosity morphed into fear when I saw him casually arrange a series of family photographs around him, each bearing a name he had refused to utter, each voice ignored long enough to induce a kind of awakening that none of us could understand. I knocked on the door, feeling the pulse of urgency throbbing in my chest, but he only yelled back at me to follow the rules, and in that moment, I realized how much he had come to believe in the very doom he had warned us about. Sure enough, the lights flickered, plunging our family home into a cold twilight, and I swore I could hear whispers, rude and jarring, beyond the door, a cacophony of voices laced with anguish and spite urging me to disregard every superstition he imprinted upon me. We checked back in the morning, again gleefully ignoring his overwrought paranoia, only to find the door ajar and my uncle nowhere in sight. The house was a disaster, papers scattered, furniture overturned, like he had tried to fend off whatever intruded, and the salt circle? Broken, just a thin line disrupted by something unseen and perilous. My parents quickly assessed the situation and called the police, reluctantly stifling our questions as frantic searching ensued. Days turned into a week before they finally found him, face contorted in horror, deep in the woods behind our home, where a freshly unearthed grave lay waiting nearby, the only belongings to mark his passing, a discarded silver locket that he always kept, along with a broken pocket watch that had stopped ticking. Officially, they deemed it a heart attack, but I could see my parents' eyes glossing over with disbelief. It was then I began to follow his rules, desperate to cling to the final remains of the man who had shared so many stories while making me feel that fear wasn't a weakness, but a warning. I banged on the side of my bed every night and murmured the names of our deceased family members, hiding my fear beneath a bravado that seemed to grow less effective as the months went on. It was last month when something shifted. I could hear a voice in the silence, taunting me, threatening to pull me into the descent my uncle had endured. Ignoring his rules was always a choice, one that inadvertently led to unrest in my heart, but a few nights ago, I spotted a figure in my rearview mirror, a shadow desperately clinging to the edge of twilight as I drove home. Since that moment, I've become obsessed with the names I had been haunted by, those I had carefully avoided speaking, and now I wonder if that had been the right choice all along, teetering on the brink of the same madness that had claimed my uncle. Nights now blur together in a chaotic spiral, with me trapped on that precipice, and more frequently, I've found myself staring long into reflective surfaces, half expecting to see my uncle appear, urging me back to the rules he'd forced upon me. 2 nights ago, I almost surrendered my own name at the whispers that grew louder, almost clawing as pressure built in my chest, suffocating as I peered into the night, ready to succumb to the temptation to speak the names I had once reverently quashed. But then it dawned on me, what if I didn't scream their names but shouted out my own, a final act of defiance against the tide threatening to pull me in. Just last night, as I locked the doors and turned the lights low, I stood alone in the dark, heart racing, preparing to say my name just as I had resolved, until it came to me that I was no longer alone. From the corner of my eye, I glimpsed a figure, almost laughing, fingers twitching excitedly. Suddenly, the rules felt like shackles, digging deeper into my skin, and I understood, what my uncle had always hinted at, the fear of unveiling the dead, had become a curse that now belonged to me. The laughter echoed, hauntingly familiar, and in that instant, I felt their fingers reach for me, knowing they wouldn't stop until they had me shout my name like an incantation, an invitation to the aftermath of despair that began the moment I let curiosity drown out caution, and I realized I was wrong to think I could escape the rules. When I was a child, The sight of my grandfather filling the ice bucket at motels was as familiar to me as the sound of his weathered voice telling stories by the fireplace. Each time we took our annual road trip across the country, we would pull into a roadside motel, and while other guests would casually settle into their rooms, Grandpa would march straight to the ice machine, each time filling the bucket to the brim with crashing cubes, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, never once explaining his curious habit despite my persistent inquiries, brushing them off with a smile, as if he believed the mystery would add to the charm. Years later, after his passing, I found myself driving to the same old motel, nostalgia thick in the air, longing to relive those simpler times, ignoring the warning signs that flickered like ghosts. The motel looked as if it had aged along with him, faded paint peeling from the walls, a lingering damp smell in the hallway. As I unlocked the door, the hinges creaked in protest, and every inch of the small room seemed to echo the memories of who I once was and who he was to me. As I settled in, I couldn't shake off the urge to fill that ice bucket just like he always did, so, without hesitation, I found myself trudging down to the grimy common area. The ice machine clanked and wheezed, and with each scoop, I felt a thrill, an odd connection to my grandfather. However, as I turned to head back, I noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway, obscured in shadows, a tall man dressed in a shabby coat, head bowed, and as I tried to catch a glimpse of his face, he turned abruptly and vanished into the darkness, a chill creeping down my spine, yet I quickly dismissed it as my overactive imagination. Returning to my room, igniting my laptop, and planning how to commemorate Grandpa. That's when I stumbled across an old family photo album filled with snapshots of his younger days, yet one particular photo caught my eye, a grainy image of him standing outside a motel that I didn't recognize, the door flung open wide, giving the sense that something sinister had recently occurred. I scrutinized the details, his smile seemed distorted, eyes darting with a hint of panic, and in the corner, faintly, I could make out another figure, a blurry shadow, and I felt my gut twist as an icy hand gripped my heart, the unease from earlier bubbling up again. I spent the next hour ensnared in the album, and something odd pulled at my memory, stories he used to tell, vague warnings about not opening doors without checking who was on the other side, a conditioned response that seemed all too prescient now, as if he had a deep-rooted fear that extended beyond typical parental concern. With every flick of the page, I overheard him narrating how encounters with strangers can shift moods from serene hopefulness to grim horror in a split second, gripping me tightly in the haunting web of his unspoken fears, as if he knew that something dark loomed over these forgotten motels. Restless, I peered out the window, looking for the figure I had seen earlier, but the outside world remained shrouded in thick night, the only illumination coming from a flickering street lamp that danced like it was caught in a ghostly waltz. And it was then when I began to feel that familiar urge wash over me, to fill the ice bucket again, driven not just by nostalgia but by an instinctual need to prepare for something unnameable. Refilling the bucket, I paused, suddenly recalling Grandpa's uncharacteristic fervor and insisting I always stay close, never let the night creep in too closely, but when I looked back at the door, I noticed something peculiar, a wedge of light creeping through the threshold, and my heart pounded as I slowly edged toward it, breath catching in my throat. That dreaded instinct he taught me clawed at my mind, and so I braced myself, throwing the door open wide with a flourish. Nothing but the chilling emptiness of the hallway met my gaze, but a door adjacent to mine stood slightly ajar, invitingly beckoning, and despite my apprehensions, I felt compelled to investigate. The moment I stepped over the threshold, I was hit by an oppressive stillness, the air thick and stifling as though the room was holding its breath, and in the far corner, illuminated by the flickering lamp, stood a large ice bucket, filled to the brim, overturned and spilling like a broken promise, causing shards of ice to glisten sinisterly against the carpet, and before I could process what I was seeing, that same shadow figure emerged from the bathroom, and in horror, I realized it was the exact man I had seen before, a gaunt specter with hollow eyes reflecting unspeakable sorrow, and just as quickly, that instinct I felt earlier screamed at me to run, but curiosity grounded me. My grandfather's voice echoed in an unforgiving whisper as the stranger stepped closer, gesturing towards the wall behind him, where I noticed a photograph pinned, a young man in a hotel room, ice bucket beside the bed, just like Grandpa's smile, but beneath the photograph, a hastily scrawled warning in fading ink, "Never let the ice melt." Suddenly, understanding washed over me like a wave. My grandfather filled the ice bucket to prevent whatever lingered in the shadows from coming out to claim you. The ice was a barrier, a talisman, A simple act of protection against the malevolent specters entwined in the memories of that motel. Now it all made sense. Just then the strangling silence erupted into a cacophony of laughter, the sound reverberating off the walls, and the stranger's voice broke through the dissonance, whispering, "How long can you keep the ice frozen?" My heart plummeted as I darted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, the shadows reaching out as I sprinted, practically throwing myself back into the safety of my own room, locking the door and feeling a strange calm in the chaotic breaths escaping me, and my heart suddenly steadied as I looked at the ice bucket filled high with shimmering cubes, and for a brief moment, I was reassured, but then I heard it. Soft knocks resonated against the walls, rhythmically syncing with the laughter that faded in and out of focus, as paranoia sunk in, gripping my throat tight, urging me to consider the truth, that in this place, my grandfather's careful habit may have been the only strand of safety tethering me to reality, that for every careful filling of ice was an invisible barrier against horrors just beyond the thin layer of weathered drywall and time, compelling me to realize that the room was alive, saturated with souls trapped within, and as the gentle knocks turned louder, pounding with a ferocity that threatened to collapse the flimsy space around me, I leaned into the ice bucket, surrendering to the realization that perhaps filling it was not just a strange habit, but a desperate cry to keep the past at bay, and so I vowed silently, as the darkness enveloped me, to never let the ice melt, understanding too late that in the end, it was never just about the ice, it was about survival, a survival dictated by a legacy far deeper than I had ever comprehended, and I wished with every trembling fiber of my being that I could hear my grandfather's voice one last time, reminding me that the true horror of the motels lay not just in their decaying walls but in the persistent reminder of the ice, forever filled, never melting, and the souls bound to its chilling embrace. I never thought much of my neighbor, Mr. Wilkins, with his scraggly beard and sunken eyes. He seemed like a relic of the past, a ghost haunting our quiet suburban street, but up until a week ago, he was just another name on the block, until my children, Lucy and Jason, began to mention him during dinner. They spoke in hushed tones, a mixture of awe and fear, of how they'd seen him in his dimly lit house, his silhouette slouched against the window, beckoning them to come closer with a crooked finger and a grin that unnerved me. At first, I thought it must be a game, a figment of their overactive imaginations fueled by bedtime stories and late-night snacks, but then one night, I caught a glimpse of his bony hand, illuminated by the flickering streetlight just outside, urging my kids to come over while I washed the dishes, their laughter echoing too close to that front lawn, too close to him. I hurried outside, heart racing, but as I did, I noticed not only how my children had no sense of danger but also how Mr. Wilkins's gaze sent shivers down my spine. It felt alive, as if it had intentions far worse than I dared to imagine. When I asked my kids about it, they giggled nervously and said he told them secrets, that he had a treasure in his basement, and with each passing night, it became harder for me to dismiss their tales. After all, childhood curiosity can often be a double-edged sword, and I didn't want to suppress their innocent wonder, but instinct told me to keep them close. Things took a darker turn when I noticed my neighbor's window glowing in the dead of night, the dull orange light flickering like a moth around a flame, just like the forbidden pull of an adventure waiting to snatch my children away. I started locking the doors early, making excuses for why they couldn't go out to play after dusk, but every night, they'd beg, pleading that Mr. Wilkins wanted to show them something magical, something they couldn't resist, and every night, the more I refused, the more desperate they sounded. My unease spiraled into paranoia. Every time I heard their laughter, I glanced out the window, expecting to find him lurking in the shadows or waiting behind the curtains, but no, he remained shrouded in darkness, his intentions hidden and sinister. I tried to talk to him, a friendly act turned hostage negotiation, hoping to reason with the man whose allure my children seemed entranced by, but he wouldn't answer my knocks, wouldn't meet my eyes, though his window always glowed when the sun dipped below the horizon. One night, I woke to silence, the kind that washes over the world before disaster strikes, and felt an intense urge to check on my children. I slipped into their rooms, only to find them missing. My heart pounded as I sprinted to that wretched house, the street lighting failing above me as if forewarning my actions. As I approached, I saw the faint glow casting long shadows up the worn steps, the door slightly ajar, a whisper of laughter and excitement creeping through the crack, pushing me further into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The basement door stood slightly open, the scent of wet earth and decay wafting up, and my children's voices, sweet and innocent, echoed from below, promising wonders I couldn't fathom. Against every instinct screaming for me to turn back, I descended, stepping into a world that flipped between wonder and horror, where the walls were lined with toys long forgotten, all missing their owners, a junkyard of childhood dreams. My heart sank as I turned a corner and saw the twisted diorama Mr. Wilkins had built, small figures resembling my kids, each one adorned with their clothing, their hair meticulously styled, and they were frozen mid-laughter, trapped under glass like fish in a jar. My blood ran cold, and before I could scream a name, a shadow lurched at me from the dark. It was Mr. Wilkins, no longer the frail neighbor but a towering enigma with eyes like bottomless pits, his fingers extended toward me as he crooned ceaselessly, his voice drenched in honey that dripped with malice. "They wanted to play with me forever," he said, his lips twisting into a horrific grin. Panic seized me as the cold realization washed over me. I turned on my heel and fled those haunted walls, he roared in anger behind me, a thunderous sound that felt out of place in our serene neighborhood, but adrenaline fueled my flight, and I burst out of the house, my breath ragged as I clutched my pounding heart, hoping desperately to find my children still safe. But a steely, deafening emptiness awaited me at home. I screamed for their names as tears blurred my vision. The shadows taunted me, but there was no answer, only echoes shrouded in darkness. The police wouldn't believe me, how could they? A neighbor's children don't just vanish, and Mr. Wilkins had a charming facade that cloaked his sinister intentions. Days turned into days, and worry morphed into a living nightmare. I couldn't sleep, haunted by my children's laughter and the image of Mr. Wilkins waiting behind that cursed window. Desperation led me back to his home time and time again, but he was never there anymore. In my state of madness, I dug through the stories of the town, interviews of children whose lives had intersected with his and vanished without a trace, each tale a ghost, haunting the street names I once knew so well. I still hear their laughter at night and see their bright faces in fleeting glimpses of dreams, but I know better now. I refuse to look at that window, though sometimes, the urge beckons me, much like my children once were. If you happen to hear laughter in the dark, beware, for there's a darkness that lingers where innocence is devoured. 2 weeks ago, I decided to install a new security system after becoming increasingly paranoid about strange noises in the dead of night and the feeling of being watched in my own home, a feeling that I brushed off repeatedly until a shadowy figure appeared outside my window one evening, just a fleeting glimpse that left an icy chill crawling up my spine. I thought it was just a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games, but the following nights were plagued by unsettling sounds, scratching at the door, whispers that seemed to float on the edge of hearing, and the occasional creak that echoed through the silence of my lonely house. And when my old camera system failed to capture anything, I convinced myself that I needed something more advanced, something that could truly keep me safe. After a frantic online search, I settled on a state-of-the-art security system with all the bells and whistles, including thermal imaging and facial recognition, and I eagerly set it up on a Friday evening. Feeling the rush of adrenaline as I activated the scanner and stood before it, my face lighting up the screen in a way that made me feel untouchable, as if the world outside couldn't harm me anymore. But I can still remember the way my heart sank when the screen showed a notification, "Unknown face detected," and I nearly laughed it off, thinking it must be my reflection or perhaps a glitch in the system. But as I watched the live feed, the figure appeared, hazy, distorted in the thermal imaging, but undeniably there, lurking just outside my front door where my dog barked with conviction, a thrumming jolt of fear coursing through me, and for an eternity, I hesitated, fingers hovering over my phone screen that was lined with confusing settings when I finally decided to send an alert to the authorities, but the app glitched and crashed, the reassuring beeping of the notifications faltering into a long silence as anxiety gripped me like a vice. As the hours passed, I rationalized, trying to convince myself it was a neighbor playing a prank and focusing instead on watching every corner of my live feed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the shadows shifted, revealing a haunting outline of what I could barely recognize as a person, skin pallid and tight over the bones, sod hollow that I thought I could peek right through, and in the depth of my dread, I noticed the figure was not just watching, it was moving, sliding close to the camera, and I could see now that the glare of its eyes were dull, lost in their sockets like two remnants of something once human, an irrational thought creeping in that it wanted me to see it, to shimmy out of the darkness and into the confines of my home. So with trembling hands, I turned off the system, hoping that by denying its reality, I could escape the terror, but sleep evaded me as I lay awake, straining to catch sounds over the rhythmic thudding of my heart against my ribs. The camera remained dormant, its absence adding a surreal comfort that I hung onto tightly, believing that some things are safer left unseen. until I heard the soft click of the front door knob turning, gently, intentionally, and before I could even think of what to do, I fled to the kitchen, pressing myself against the fridge, frozen in fear, when I noticed the faint glow of my security camera booting back up, a terse face looming large on my screen and its cold breath fogging the lens, the enveloping dark of my kitchen contrasting sharply against the bright clarity of my camera, the figure now standing fully visible, its mouth stretching into a vicious smile that didn't reach those dead eyes, and as it raised a skeletal hand toward the camera, I found myself screaming into the stillness, a raw sound that felt alien against the creeping dread. I didn't dare step away from the fridge, the meager barrier between my breathing reflection and whatever monstrosity lurked less than a few feet away, but there was an overwhelming urge to escape and find refuge elsewhere, the panic surging through me as I dashed into the bathroom, locking the door, but in my haste, I glanced at my phone to order a ride or a way out, only for it to brighten my face and instead illuminate the bathroom. A dark rectangle hovered in my entryway, no longer just a figment of the camera but without a trace of warmth or humanity, and every instinct screamed for me to keep quiet as the kitchen door creaked open, the unsettling silence interrupted only by soft footsteps, pacing one step at a time, the dread pooling in my stomach until it settled heavily, and with a sudden explosion of sound, my phone pinged. The alerts I thought I would never see again flooded the screen, but they weren't from my camera, no. They were from an old neighborhood app I had forgotten about, filled with sporadic reports of break-ins and suspicious individuals lurking, and then I got a notification that made my blood run cold. Unknown face detected at your address, and the weight of fear grew unbearable as the footsteps halted, the silence consuming me like a thick fog, and just as I was about to slip into deeper panic, my phone buzzed again, the same app lighting up with fresh urgency, revealing a twist that sent my thoughts spiraling. We have confirmed a breach in your home and authorities are on the way. Please call 911 immediately if you are in danger. Tears blurred my vision as I glanced out of the small bathroom window, the quiver of the curtains directing my gaze towards the front yard where the streetlight dimly illuminated a figure standing in the shadows, unmoving and still, and then I felt it, a cold hand pressing against the back of my head through the wall, and I could hear its breath, hot and rancid, seeping into my mind as I curled into myself quietly, because I knew what I had to do. My heart raced, pounding into my ears as I fought every urge to scream, locking my gaze on my reflection in the mirror, and as I dialed 911, I prepared myself to confront whatever horror was waiting, but the screen lit up with yet another kind of fear, broadcasting the lifeless face of the wandering figure staring back through my camera, right into my soul, and in that moment, I knew, I think I need a new security system. They never listen. They never believe. But I'll keep trying, because that's all I can do. That's all I've ever been able to do. It all started on that warm July afternoon when the sun hung low like a giant, bloated eye watching over Maplewood, a town where nothing ever happened, and secrets ebbed beneath the surface like water trying to hide from the sun. I was just 15, a skinny kid with overgrown hair and an imagination that always seemed to run wild, but by the time the school bell rang, that day was already tainted with a dread I couldn't shake. My friends had planned to head to the lake, but instead, I found myself wandering the wooded trails behind my house, hoping to clear my head. I leaned against a massive oak tree, my fingers tracing the rough bark, when I noticed a clearing a few dozen feet away that I was sure hadn't existed before. Curiosity tugged at me, and I stepped closer. In the center, there was an old well, stone and crumbling, half buried in vines. I peered down and saw nothing but darkness, an emptiness so profound it felt like the pit of an endless void. I called out, feeling foolish, but I thought I heard a whisper, a soft plea blending with the rustling leaves. It chilled me, but I pushed it aside and rushed home, eager to share my discovery. I burst through the door, my words tumbling over one another, but my mother just glanced up from her book and returned to her pages, dismissing me as usual. It's just a well, she said, yawning. There are tons of them around. My friends laughed, hurling jokes my way, and even though their teasing should have stung, I felt a different kind of urgency, like an alarm ringing in my bones. I had to go back. That night, unable to sleep, I slipped out of my house and wandered into the woods, following the moonlight. The well loomed larger than before, shadows sprawled across the ground like fingers reaching out to pull me in. I stood there, captivated by an inexplicable force, and when I leaned closer to the well, the whisper came again, distinct now, beckoning me. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but curiosity chained my feet to the spot. I tossed in a pebble, but instead of the expected splash, All I felt was a weight pressing down, as though the well had absorbed my offering. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "I'm trapped." I staggered back, heart racing. No one would believe me, nobody ever did. But I had to do something. I ran home, grabbed an old flashlight, and bolted back to the well, my heart pounding like a war drum as the light flickered and emitted a soft glow against the inky dark. "Who are you?" I shouted down the well, my voice echoing around me. "What's down there?" A moment passed, silence wrapping around me like a shroud, and just as I was about to turn away in despair, the voice surged back, frail yet unmistakable. "I was forgotten. They locked me away and left me to die." I trembled. Was it a ghost? Or something worse? I considered calling for help, but no one would believe me. They'd say I was just a kid with a wild imagination. Instead, I leaned closer, the cold air crawling into my bones, and asked, "How do I help you?" "You must lower something, anything, to reach me," it replied. "And when you do, believe." The urgency of those words clung to my mind, and I began rummaging through my pockets, desperate for something to offer. I found an old bottle cap from the soda I'd had earlier, and without thinking, I tied it to a long piece of string. It was pathetic, hardly worth a single glance, but I lowered it, watching the cap descend, and as it disappeared into the darkness, the well seemed to pulse, an almost grateful shiver coursing through the ground. I pulled the cap back up, only to find it coated in an oily substance like something that should never exist in this world. Panic rose in my throat, but I couldn't stop now. The thought of leaving that voice down there, alone and dying, drove me onward. "What's your name?" I yelled, trying to break the unease wrap around my chest. "Kara," it replied, its voice clearer, rising like smoke. Just a girl who never had the chance to escape. I felt a sharp pang of empathy, but doubt crept in. Could she be lying? I didn't have the luxury of time or the strength of belief the voice demanded, but as the days passed, Kara became my silent accomplice in the solitude of my teenage life. I'd visit the clearing every night, trying to convince myself it wasn't madness. My friends continued to dismiss me, even my best friend Alex rolled his eyes when I dragged him along. "Dude, it's a freaking well. Let's go get pizza instead," he said, and I felt like I had lost my chance to search for whatever freedom I thought I could bring to her. But I couldn't let go. I decided that I wouldn't let their disbelief silence me. On the 10th night, I returned with a backpack full of stones, my stomach churning with the prospect of my plan. I hoisted the first stone over the well and yelled, "Kara, I'm coming." And as it struck the bottom, the voice returned, urgent and gasping, "More. You must believe. Bring me something more." The ground shook, branches cracked, and I could swear a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I dropped stone after stone, the earth shifting beneath my feet until the last stone sank with a sickening thud. "Kara," I cried out. "Are you still there?" "Yes. You're close. But you need to believe harder. You need to jump." For a heartbeat, I hesitated. Jump? What did she mean? I was standing right on the edge of madness. The cold wind pulled at me, whispering doubts, but every flickering light in my memory, the thoughts of her trapped, begging for freedom, heated my blood. I gulped down fear, my heart a wild beast, and leapt toward the gaping maw of the void. I felt weightless for an instant before landing crouched on a damp stone floor, breathless and disoriented. The darkness surrounded me, and an overwhelming smell of decay filled my lungs. "Kara?" I called, panic clawing at my insides. There was only silence, a stillness that felt ancient and malevolent. The voice was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet. I tried to rise, but the ground felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. That's when I realized, in the darkness, shadows formed shapes that pulled and twisted, anchoring me in place. "You shouldn't have come here," a whisper lingered, colder than I could bear. And then I saw her, shadowy and translucent, her smile a twisted mockery. "You were never supposed to believe. I lost that power ages ago." The realization crushed me like a stone, and the last flicker of hope extinguished in my chest. The darkness thickened, becoming something sentient, swallowing every glint of light. I screamed, thrashing against the grip of the nightmare that had ensnared me, but deep down, a part of me understood. They never listen, never believe, and maybe they were right to stay away. Because once you step into the shadows, they consume everything you are, and I was no longer just trying to save a girl, I had become another whisper in the abyss, waiting for the next fool to come along who might foolishly believe. Now, I am the voice calling from the well, reminding you that knowing the truth can be the lost key to your freedom, but in this world, knowledge often comes at a horrible price, the price of listening, believing, and jumping into the unknown. I was asked to babysit a washing machine, and at first, I thought it was just a bizarre joke, but my neighbor Maggie, who was polite but a touch eccentric, insisted that I look after her appliance because, as she put it, it has a mind of its own. I chuckled but agreed to help her out when she mentioned that she'd be gone for the weekend. It was a small favor, after all, how much trouble could a washing machine really cause? Unfortunately, this was a favor I'd come to regret profoundly. The moment she left, the house felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of something. I settled on the couch with a book while casting occasional glances at the laundry room. The washing machine was a sleek, shiny model, seemingly ordinary, yet there was an unsettling feeling in the air whenever I heard it hum. As night settled in and the shadows stretched dark and long, I noticed that it began to vibrate more vigorously during the spin cycle, louder than I remembered. At first, I attributed it to old machinery, but the rattling grew peculiar, a rhythmic thumping that almost sounded like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. I shook off my unease and continued reading, but the persistent pounding turned into laughter, soft at first, like a distant echo intertwining with the mechanical sounds, sending chills down my spine. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the darkening room. After all, it was nearly midnight, and I was alone. As I pushed the dread aside, the laughter morphed into whispers, a cacophony of hushed voices weaving in and out of recognition. The laundry room door was slightly ajar, and I felt an irresistible urge to peek inside. I approached slowly, feeling as though I were intruding on something deeply personal, and when I finally crossed the threshold, the washing machine stood there, oblivious yet so unnervingly alive. The laughter echoed louder, the voices becoming clearer, and I swore I heard a name being called, mine, tauntingly, softly, weaving through the air like smoke. I backed away instinctively, but the machine vibrated harder, and I felt a strange pull, a magnetic force compelling me forward. I took a breath, tightening my grip on the doorframe, and leaned in closer, the whispers growing more insistent, more demanding. Suddenly, the lid of the machine flung itself open with a violent thud, and I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. Something flickered in the depths of the drum, a dark shadow undulating, and I could see it, a swirling mass of damp fabrics and what looked like fingers stretching out as if searching for an anchor. Morbidly curious, despite every rational fiber in my body screaming at me to run, I peered inside again. That was when the light flickered, illuminating what had to be a reflection, only it wasn't mine, it was a face, twisted in anger and sorrow, eyes dark voids devouring the light, yet I discerned something more tragic, a silent plea woven within its distorted features. My heart raced as reality warped around me, and the machine thrummed as if gorging itself on my fear, feeding on the very essence of dread. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I could no longer hear the laughter. It had been replaced with frantic, disembodied screams that morphed into my name, a chilling chorus echoing from within the metallic monster. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone to call Maggie, but my fingers trembled too much to dial. Instead, I stumbled into the living room, hoping the brightness would rescue me from the enveloping darkness. It didn't. The whispers pursued me, sitting on the walls, crawling in my ears, and just as I thought I could escape, the power flickered, and everything went black. Drenched in darkness, I heard the washing machine hum back to life, the sound swelling in intensity until it erupted into a cacophony of mechanical howls. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise until the maddening echoes of my name ceased. When the lights returned, the house was suffused with a sickly yellow glow, and I stood paralyzed in the living room while the washing machine trembled menacingly from the hallway. Just then, the front door creaked open, revealing the silhouette of Maggie, her face grim but devoid of surprise. "You shouldn't have let it out," she said flatly, her voice chilling under the circumstances. "It likes to play, and it hates when you resist." She stepped into the house, still holding her bag, and I managed to gather the resolve to move. I rushed towards her, desperate for an explanation, but her icy gaze severed any warmth I expected from a neighbor. "What do you mean?" I gasped, the terror and confusion mingling in my throat. "Sometimes, we wash away memories," she said, her voice low, filled with something like regret, "and sometimes, not all the memories come out clean." She walked past me with an unsettling calmness directly to the washing machine, which seemed to pulsate as if fed by her presence. I watched in horror as she opened the lid without a flicker of hesitation, revealing a void blacker than night. Instead of screaming, her expression shifted to something almost reverential. "You tried to leave too," she said, staring into the abyss but not flinching. "But it keeps holding on." I stepped back, dread curdling in my gut, the laughter now a distant memory but not the whispers. They were all around me, creeping under my skin, nipping at the edges of rationality. "Don't," I shouted, but it resonated in a hollow echo as I watched Maggie lean forward into whatever unspeakable darkness lay in the machine. It was as if she were merging her soul with the fabric of lost memories, and as I turned to run, the whispers crescendoed into frantic cries, enveloping me like a storm. Something cold coiled around me, and I realized with crushing dread that I wasn't escaping, I was being drawn into the very heart of that washing machine, a vortex of everything that had been lost, every name ever called, every life that had been sucked into the abyss, and just like that, I was swept away, my wails swallowed by their sinister symphony, forever caught in a laundry cycle of forgotten nightmares.